Hi everyone, my name is Tom Pettit and welcome back to this week's episode of Beyond Come Follow Me. This week in your Come Follow Me lessons, you are studying the doctrine that is contained in sections 94, 95, 96, and 97. And as I do each week, I'm excited to share with you the historical context of what was going on in those early days of the church that led the Lord to reveal these important sections. This week I've been looking forward to for the last 8 months. When I started doing these videos back in January, I looked at the calendar and I saw that we would be talking about the Kirtland Temple this week, and I've been looking forward to it for about 8 months now. Some of my most favorite stories from church history have to do with the building of the Kirtland Temple, and now the time has arrived for me to be able to share those with you, which I'm excited to do. Now you got to understand the history behind the history. Joseph didn't receive these revelations that you're studying this week, and that being the introduction to building a temple. In fact, the idea of a temple started long ago, back in Palmyra, in September of 1823. Now, the first vision had taken place 3 years prior. Joseph was praying one night, September 1823, next to his bed, and the angel Moroni appears. The angel Moroni tells him 6 things. He first calls him by name. He knows his name. Your name is Joseph. Moroni then introduces himself. I am Moroni. I am sent from the very presence of God. The Lord has an important work for you to do, Joseph, and because of that work, your name will be had for good and evil throughout this world. He then tells him the 4th thing. In a nearby hill is deposited on gold plates a record, which contains the everlasting gospel of Jesus Christ as delivered by him to the ancient inhabitants of this continent. And then the 5th and 6th thing that Moroni talks about the rest of the night is the temple and preparing for the second coming. Now, he doesn't talk specifically about the temple in that, Joseph, you're going to build a temple and here's what you'll do in the temple. But rather, he quotes from Malachi, turning the hearts of the fathers to the children, children to the fathers. And then he's teaching that doctrine to Joseph. Well, the years would pass. Joseph would translate the Book of Mormon. He'd receive the Aaronic and the Melchizedek priesthood. Baptisms, confirmations would occur. The church was officially organized on April 6, 1830. All of these things culminating and pointing towards the temple. And so Joseph is living in Fayette at the Whitmer farm. The church has been organized. All these things of the restoration had taken place. And he's sending missionaries out to spread the gospel. A missionary companionship of 4 missionaries head out on a mission. One of those missionaries was Parley P. Pratt. I went into great detail of all these stories in past videos. You might remember, you could check out another time. But Parley P. Pratt and his 3 missionary companions are headed out to Missouri. And they pass through a town called Mentor, Ohio, and that's where Parley's from. So Parley goes, he starts to preach the gospel to his friends, to his family, to his neighbors, to people who he went to church with before he was a member of our church. And they had great success there. 2 of those individuals that Parley testified to were Sidney Rigdon, who accepted baptism along with his wife Phoebe, and Edward Partridge, who believed but wanted to meet the prophet before accepting baptism. So Sidney Rigdon and Edward Partridge head from Mentor, Ohio, which is right next door to Kirtland, and they head to Fayette to meet the prophet. While there, Edward Partridge gets baptized, but Sidney Rigdon tells Joseph, hey, over in the Mentor and Kirtland area, we're having a lot of success. In fact, we've got more members of the church out there than you have in all of New York, and we don't have any persecution. The one thing we're lacking is leadership. Joseph says, I see what you mean, Sidney. So he prays and asks the Lord about these things. And in response, the Lord gives section 38. And in verse 32 of section 38, the Lord says, go to the Ohio, and there I will give unto you my law and endow you with power from on high. Again, talking about the temple. Joseph goes to Kirtland. All the Kirtland stories that I've shared with you over the past weeks occur. And then section 88 comes along. And in verse 119, the Lord tells Joseph about a house, but specifically his house, the temple. And he talks about what that house is going to be. It's going to be a house of prayer, fasting, faith, learning, glory, order, even a house of God. Here, more talk of the temple. In section 95 now he's been, of all the history of this temple talk, Joseph then received the commandment to build the temple. And in section 95, Verse 3, the Lord comes and says to Joseph, "For ye have sinned against me a very grievous sin." What did Joseph do? "In that you have not considered the great commandment in all things." What was the commandment? "That have been given unto you concerning the building of my house." Joseph had been taught for a decade about the temple, and he was commanded to build the temple. Well, he was dragging his feet, and probably for good reason. He didn't know what a temple was. He didn't know what it looked like. He didn't know what to do with it after he got it. He's just a simple farm boy. He's never built a temple, let alone he's never built even a home, let alone a temple. And so the Lord says, "Hey, stop dragging your feet. It's time to build." In verse 8 of that same section, "Yea, verily I say unto you, I gave," meaning this commandment came before, "I gave unto you a commandment, that you should build a house, in which house I design to endow those whom I have chosen with power from on high." Going back, almost quoting word for word that verse out of section 38. We need this house, we need a temple where the Lord can give unto us his law and endow us with power from on high. So Joseph says, no longer to delay, we've got to do something. So he gathers a bunch of trusted individuals, and he opens it up for discussion. "Brethren, we've been commanded to build a temple. Anybody got any ideas?" And the conversations started going. It was like a council. They started counseling with each other. Somebody said, "Joseph, we know how to build homes. If the Lord wants a house, we know how to build a log home. We'll make it nice. We'll make it big." Somebody else said, "Oh, but we can do better than that. We know how to build frame homes. In fact, Newell has a 2-story store. Newell K. Whitney has a 2-story store. And so we know how to build them big, build them nice. So Joseph, what if we did it that way?" This conversation continued on until Joseph, he certainly became somewhat frustrated. And he said, "Brethren, you don't understand what we're doing. We're not building a house for man. We're building a house for God." And with that, he dismissed the meeting. Well, he's left there in the room with his counselors, Sidney Rigdon and Frederick G. Williams. And they did the only thing they knew how to do. They trusted in the Lord. If you go back to section 95 and you look at verse 14, "Therefore let it be built after the manner which I shall show unto thee." So the promise is given. Joseph, you're not going to build a log cabin. You're not going to build a frame home, but you're going to do it after the pattern which I'm going to show you. Sounds like Nephi in his boat. And so they trusted on that promise. Meeting concludes. It's just the three of them. Frederick G. Williams, this is his quote, "We went upon our knees, called on the Lord, and the building appeared within viewing distance, I being the first to discover it. Then all of us viewed it together. After we had taken a good look at the exterior, the building seemed to come right over us." That's the end of the quote. But let me get into detail about what's going on. That's the full quote. Let me break it apart. So they're there after the meeting. They begin to pray. They're trusting that the Lord will show them. They pray to be shown what the temple is going to be like. Frederick G. Williams claims that he saw the vision first. He nudges, wakes him up, not wakes him up, but interrupts the prayer and says, "Hey, Sidney, Joseph, look out the window at what I see." And they look out the window, and through the window and across the little gully kind of valley, very, very little valley. If you've been to Kirtland, you're picturing Joseph in his upstairs room at the Newell K. Whitney store, looking out the window towards the temple. You can't see it today because of the overgrowth of the trees, but they could see the hill at the time where the temple was to be built and where the temple stands right now. And they looked and they gazed upon it and they see it. And they start marveling. That's the temple. That's what we're going to build. And after some time, after they're through that excitement, as Frederick G. Williams explains, it was as if they were transported to the outside of the temple. And now they were walking around it. And they were gazing at it. And they were marveled at what they were seeing. And Frederick G. Williams, he says that they comprehended the whole of it. The eyes of our understanding were opened and we comprehended the whole of it. Meaning we understood. We were enlightened. We understood, even though it's given in section 94, we understood without using a tape measure how long it was, how wide it was, how tall it was. He says we understood what it was going to be made out of. We understood where the windows were, how many windows there were. They comprehended everything as if the building plan had been handed to them. And it was just placed in their minds. He said once they comprehended the whole of it, and then, quoting directly, the building seemed to come right over us. And now they're on the inside. So this is a real interactive vision. They're able to tour the Kirtland Temple. And the eyes of their understanding were opened, he said once again, until we comprehended the whole of it. Meaning they knew everything. They knew that there was going to be a choir box in each of the four corners. They knew that there was going to be an upper court. There was going to be a lower court. What the upper court was going to be used for, what the lower court was going to be used for. They knew that there were going to be schoolrooms on the third floor. They knew about the basement. They knew about the pews. They knew about the pulpits on each floor and on each end. And even what those pulpits were to be used for and what they represented. Now, at the end of this video, I'm going to interrupt my story here for a minute and just tell you about the end. At the end of this video, I'm going to give you an interior tour of the Kirtland Temple. Of course, I'm not going to record while I'm inside the temple, but I'm going to show you pictures and just do a little voiceover of it so that you can see what it is, and I'll take you on that little virtual tour. That's going to come at the end. So back to the story. There, the presidency is inside the Kirtland Temple, and they're comprehending everything. And as soon as they understood it all, as soon as they had it upstairs, then the vision closed, and they were back in Joseph's office. As you know, the blueprints for the Kirtland Temple weren't drawn up until after the completion of the temple. It's because the first presidency knew it. And so they've got a vision of it. They know exactly what to do. So they gather up another group of men. Maybe it's the same group of trusted men, or anyway, there's individuals that they take with them to this temple lot, or where the temple is going to be built. And Joseph starts to describe to the brethren what's going on. And as he's describing what's happening, he gets a little distracted. Over off to the side is Hiram, his brother. Hiram got a sickle, and he's starting to hack down the weeds. He's clearing the lot. He has a shovel, and he starts moving dirt. Hiram, what are you doing? Says Joseph. Hiram says, if we are going to build a temple, I'm going to be the first to start on it. Joseph says, it's not recorded, but this is the attitude back to Hiram, is, Brother Hiram, I love your zeal, but we have to purchase the property first. It was owned by some farmer. Well, there was a process to go through. They needed to secure the property, which they were able to do. And but before this group of men departed and broke up, Joseph describes to the men that were there what this building is going to look like. This massive structure. This is no frame home that this group had previously suggested. And Joseph says, I don't know how to do this. Does anybody know how to do this? And I'm sure there was some uncomfortable silence for a minute before Lorenzo Young raises his hand and he says, Joseph, I know somebody. His name's Artemis Millet. He lives up in Canada, but he's not a member of the church. Now, the rest of the Artemis Millet story that I'm going to share with you is recorded or was written down by Artemis's son Joseph, who was just a child during the Kirtland era, but he said that he got the story from Brigham. So just this story comes from the kid who wrote it down as Brigham told it years later. That's where this story comes from. So Lorenzo Young says, I know a man, Artemis Millet, up in Canada. He's not a member of the church though, but he could do this for us. Joseph, without even responding to Lorenzo Young, he turns to Brigham Young and he says, Brigham, I give unto you a mission. You're to go to Canada, find this Artemis Millet, preach him the gospel and baptize him. Bring him to Kirtland and have him help us build the temple. And then almost as an afterthought, Joseph says, oh, and tell him to bring $1,000 and donate it to the church. And Brigham's response was simply, Yes, I will, Joseph. And Brigham dismisses himself from the meeting to head home and pack, to walk 300 miles to Canada. Brigham does just that, though. He gets to Canada, he finds Artemus Millet, he preaches him the gospel, he baptizes him, and then he asks he and his wife to relocate their family, leave their business behind, and to come to Canada and help build the temple. Artemus does just that. He sells his business interests, personal property and whatnot, and when he does so, Brigham returns to him and says, the prophet would also like you to donate $1,000 to the building of the temple. And Artemus does. Now, before we continue in the story, I'd like to ask a question. Of course, it's rhetorical for you to just think about, but who are you most impressed with in this story? Really, we've got three characters. We've got Joseph, we've got Brigham, and Artemus. Some might say I'm most impressed with Joseph, just trusting and relying on the Lord. That the Lord commanded something, and so he's going to make a way, even if it requires this awesome conversion story of Artemus Millet. And so he has the faith and determination, the Lord will provide a way, so I'm going to extend this mission call to Brigham. That's pretty bold, pretty powerful. But what about Brigham? Maybe you're most impressed with Brigham. Brigham didn't wait for anything. He said, Joseph, if that's what you want me to do, I'm out of here. Now, most of us, myself very much included, would say, wow, that's an impossible task, or a very difficult task at the very least. You really want me to do that? I've got to walk 300 miles, 600 miles round trip and convince this guy to follow me back to Kirtland? That's tough to do, but not for Brigham. Brigham said, if you want me to do it, I'm on my way. In fact, I'm leaving right now. And he did. Or you might say, I'm most impressed with Artemus. Artemus not only accepted the gospel, but he accepted the responsibility that comes with accepting the gospel, in that he was willing to be obedient to anything and everything that the Lord asks of him. If the Lord commands it, I will do it, was Artemis's attitude. And so he did do it. He came to Kirtland, and he was the chief architect of the Kirtland temple. When he gets to Kirtland, he finds that the men had been making brick, and it was very laborious. It was hard. It took a long time, and it was very expensive. And Artemus, he says, I'm got some experience in working with sandstone. What do you think the chances are that there's sandstone around here? Well, a search party went out. Just a simple 1.5 miles down the road from the temple lot, they found sandstone, and enough sandstone to build the temple. In fact, there was more sandstone. If you've been to Kirtland and you have visited the temple quarry, you can see that there's a ton of sandstone that they didn't use, still sitting there on the banks of a river. And so, boy, you think of how the Lord's hand has been in this. And I'm going to tell you some more stories that prove that to be factual as well. But up to this point, miracle after miracle after miracle, the Lord is setting things up, starting all the way back in September 1823, remember, to get everything in the right place at the right time. Not only with the story of Artemus Millet, but also other stories I'm going to share with you today, and also other stories I've shared with you before, and many more to come. It's always true that whenever the Lord needs something done, he sends somebody who can do it. And the Lord continues to prove that his work won't be slowed down by anything. If we need an architect who can build a temple, great. We'll go pluck him out of Canada, convert him, and bring him. And those sorts of stories happen over and over, and they even happen today, no doubt. Well, and so in part of that point, we think we've got sandstone, the very stone that Artemus Millet needed to build this temple. And there's a huge deposit of this particular stone just 1.5 miles down the road. So, boy, the Lord didn't start in September 1823 to get the Kirtland temple ready. You got to think all the way back to the days of creation, when in his infinite, eternal wisdom, he says, we need a deposit of sandstone to be right here, so that centuries, millenniums later, we'll have the right person at the right time to utilize that stone to build the temple, in which we'll perform temple ordinances, and perhaps most importantly, restore priesthood keys that will be able to bless the lives of every Latter-day Saint. So we've got Artemis there. We've got the stone there. The temple is being built. Before I finish off with the story of the construction, I now want to tell you a story about a man by the name of John Tanner. And John Tanner, again, was an individual that the Lord used for his purposes, for his work and his glory. The Lord needed something, so he called upon John Tanner and put John in the right place at the right time so that the work of the Lord could be accomplished. Now I've got to take you back. I want to tell you, not in too much detail to take too much time, but I want to tell you a lot about John Tanner. John was living in New England, and I've got to tell you some background of John so that we can really appreciate who he was and what he gave up for the Kirtland Temple. Now, John, he was living in New England, and he was incredibly wealthy. He had his hand in a lot of different businesses, and he had created an immense amount of wealth. He was a Methodist, and he saw an advertisement of these Mormon missionaries who were going to come and preach about the Mormon doctrine. And it was an invitation advertisement. And so he decided that he was going to go to this meeting so that he could learn about Mormonism and so he could prove them wrong. He went and he sat in the meeting and he listened. And these two missionaries, they preached boldly, convincingly of the truthfulness of the restored gospel. And at the end of the meeting, John requested and purchased a copy of the Book of Mormon. He took it home and he compared it side by side with the Bible. He was convinced that the Book of Mormon was true. He received personal lessons from the missionaries who were preparing him for baptism. And when they invited him to be baptized, he said, I can't be baptized because of my leg. I can't submerge myself in water. Now, what was wrong with his leg? He had an infection in his leg, and it had grown to this huge sore, and it was continuing to grow, the infection. And he called upon doctors, doctor after doctor, and each one of them, they all said the same thing. John, you've got to amputate your leg, or it's going to kill you. And John simply said, well, I came into this life with 2 legs. I'm going to leave this life with 2 legs. And so he continued to refuse to have it amputated. So when the missionaries invited him to be baptized, John said, I want to be baptized. I can't because of my leg problem. The missionaries asked if he had faith to be healed the way Jesus healed others in biblical times. And John said, yes, of course, I have faith that I could be healed. And so the missionaries gave him a priesthood blessing. And immediately after that blessing, John stood up without his crutches and began to walk. That's all John needed. He needed 2 good legs to walk into the water to be baptized. And so he was baptized. Now, after he was baptized, he gave of his money freely to the church and for those who needed it. He was not only incredibly wealthy, but incredibly generous with his wealth. He sent 2 of his sons, financed 2 of his sons to join Joseph and others on Zion's camp, which I'll talk about, I think, next week or the week after that, exactly what that was. He also financed 50 others to join Zion's camp in that march with Joseph to Missouri. He helped 7 other families in the area, in his neighborhood, who had been converted. He financed their relocation to Kirtland. Soon after his baptism, John, who liked to drink alcohol and liked to drink coffee and occasionally used tobacco, perhaps. Coffee and alcohol, we do know. But he learned about the word of wisdom. And he was told at the time, it wasn't a commandment, it was a word of wisdom. Something you should do, but you don't have to, not yet. And John's response to that word of wisdom was, if the Lord is suggesting that I do this, then even the mere suggestion, I'm doing it. And so he gives it up on the spot. He doesn't wean himself off of those things that he enjoyed. He just said, cold turkey, I'm done. And so he was, just another demonstration of his faith. Well, he decided that he was, excuse me, I got just ahead of myself. He decides to give up, and anything that was contrary to the word of wisdom, he decides to completely obey it. Now, while this is going on, he has this great conversion. He's sharing his money with these saints, helping and supporting the church in that way. Joseph's having a little problem back in Kirtland with the temple. When they secured the temple lot, they had to sign a mortgage, and they had to make payments on that mortgage. Joseph and the church had fallen behind, and they got to a point where it was impossible to make the mortgage payment. Joseph had 3 weeks until the temple lot was going to be foreclosed on. During that time, Joseph prays and asks the Lord, please send someone who can help us. At that same time, John Tanner had a dream in which he saw he and his family moving to Kirtland. He awoke. He interpreted that dream as a commandment of the Lord to go to Kirtland. So he sells everything. He can't take his farm and his house, so he starts selling everything. He sells the things that he owned, 2,200 acres of farmland, a hotel, multiple homes, 2 profitable farms, a sawmill, a dairy. He even owned a private island, which he sold. And with all that cash in hand, he and his wife and his children relocate to Kirtland. It's a 500-mile journey. John Tanner arrived the day before the temple lot was going to be foreclosed on. And when he heard about the difficult situation that the prophet faced, John went to the prophet with $2,000 and gave it to Joseph. Joseph, pay the mortgage note. Be free and clear. Don't make any more payments. Here's $2,000 to do so. Joseph Smith, he writes out a promissory note. I, Joseph Smith, received this money on this date from John Tanner, and I promise I'm going to give it back to him. And he signs it, hands that note, that promissory note to John Tanner. And he says, when I can, I'll make good on it. John Tanner puts it in his pocket, and he held on to it for many years. John then gave $13,000 more towards the construction of the temple. He gave an additional $30,000 to Joseph to help with all the affairs of the church. He saved the temple. The reason the temple stands today is because of John Tanner. John would eventually give all the rest of his money. From all the sale proceeds of all that property and business that he had in his previous home, he gave it all to the church. And he continued to follow the church. He followed the prophet wherever the prophet went. So when it was time to leave Kirtland and go to Missouri, John Tanner and his family loaded up a broken down wagon and followed the prophet to Missouri. In fact, when he left Kirtland, of the tens of thousands of dollars that John once had, he left Kirtland with $7.50 in his pocket, an old horse, a broken down wagon, and 9 kids. They made their way to Missouri, begging for food along the way. His wife, in no doubt sorrow, in her journal recorded, in 3 short years, we went from immense prosperity to begging for food. But she did it along with John because of their faith in the Lord, their trust in Joseph, and their desire to do anything that the Lord asked of them to do. They gave it all. Along the way to Missouri, they buried a daughter on the side of the road. Not only did they lose all their worldly wealth, but it's now cost the life of a daughter, this struggle that they're faced with. From Missouri, the saints went to Nauvoo. John and his family, they settled on the western bank of the Mississippi River in Iowa, in Montrose, Iowa, where a lot of Latter-day Saints settled. We had a lot of people in Nauvoo. We had a lot of people across the river in Iowa. My ancestors included. They were in Iowa. Well, John was called on a mission in 1844. You know that year. That's the year that the prophet was martyred. Early in 1844, the prophet issued a mission call to John Tanner. John Tanner accepted the mission call, and he left the comforts of whatever kind of comforts he has at this point of life, but he left his home and his family to go and serve the Lord in the mission field. As John is leaving town, he crosses the river into Nauvoo, to leave on his mission from there. And as he's leaving town, he meets Joseph on the street in Nauvoo. And they sit and they talk and they reminisce. They have a great relationship, of course. And in the midst of that conversation, John pulls from his pocket that promissory note. Now you think about John's situation. John is leaving his wife and now 8 kids on the other side of the river in Iowa. They're destitute. They have no money. They have no food. Although just a few years prior, they had been accustomed to having anything and everything that could be purchased with money available to them. They're in a bad situation. And now John's going on a mission. In one final act of bringing a little bit of comfort and hope and support to his family, John could have asked, even demanded that $2,000 and given it to his wife. So he's in that situation. He meets the prophet. He pulls out the promissory note and he hands it to Joseph. Joseph unfolds it. He sees what it is, the debt that Joseph owes John. And Joseph says to John, Father Tanner, which he was affectionately called by, Father Tanner, I owe you a debt. And Father Tanner says, Brother Joseph, the only debt is that of gratitude, and it is mine. He took the note back from Joseph and tore it up. Joseph, being overcome with emotion, he says to Father Smith, he gives him a prophecy, a promise. He says, God bless you, Father Smith. Your children shall never again beg for food. And through numerous miracles, that prophecy was always fulfilled. The begging for food stopped. And the Lord took care of the Tanner family. And of the descendants that I have met of John Tanner, it's their testimony that the prophecy continues. And that although they don't claim worldly fortunes, they've been taken care of and blessed by the Lord. In all, it's estimated that John Tanner gave about $50,000 to the church, which would be hundreds of thousands of dollars in today's dollars. Now let's get back to the building of the temple. The building continues, but not without struggle. Eliza R. Snow says, at that time, meaning at the time of the building of the Kirtland Temple, at that time the saints were too few in number, and most of them very poor, and had it not been for the assurance that God had spoken, and had commanded that a house should be built to his name, of which he not only revealed the form, but also the design of the dimensions, an attempt towards building that temple under the then existing circumstances would have been, by all concerned, pronounced preposterous. Brigham Young, in reflecting on this time period, he says, the church members were too few in numbers, too weak in faith, and too poor in purse to attempt such a mighty enterprise. But by the means of all these stimulants, a mere handful of men living on air, a little honey and milk could not be had. The great prophet Joseph Smith in the stone quarry, quarrying rock with his own hands, and the few then in the church following his example of obedience and diligence wherever most needed, with laborers on the walls holding the sword in one hand to protect themselves from the mob, while they placed the stone and moved the trowel with the other. And Brigham there gives us a little insight into what was going on with the non-members of the church. They had proclaimed, quote, the walls of that temple shall never be erected. The opposition was coming. It was heavy. It was hard. It was threatening. And it was very real. And it was literally at their doorsteps. Heber C. Kimball testified in his journal that we would work all day, that we never slept, is what he said. Because they would work all day and then stand guard all night. It was the intention of the mob to destroy any building that was going on. And then Heber C. Kimball also testified that for every one man that was working on the temple, there were 2 standing guard. There's a lot of concern going on here. But the Lord promises in section 95, verse 11, "Verily I say unto you, that it is my will that you should build a house. If you keep my commandments, you shall have power to build it." Now that was given before the construction, but that promise lingered forever. And no doubt they relied on, and with their faith on that promise. If you keep my commandments, you shall have power to build it. So we look back at this whole story of building the Kirtland Temple, all the way back to that first meeting of, brethren, anybody got any ideas? Until the day of dedication and everything in between. And we see that the Lord made good on his promise, not only because it was built, but because despite the lack of money, the lack of knowledge, the lack of skill, the lack of abilities, everything that Brigham and Eliza listed out there that the church members were lacking in, yet the Lord said, hey, I've commanded it, so I'm going to make a way for it to happen. It's the lesson of Nephi. I will go and do the things which the Lord hath commanded. For I know that the Lord giveth no commandment unto the children of men, save he shall prepare a way that they can accomplish it. And so it was with the Kirtland Temple. Well, the structure is done. It's now time to take care of the inside. And as the interior was being done and finalized, the carpentry and whatnot, it was time to make it look pretty. Now, who was called upon to make it look good? The sisters of the church. They're in there working away, making it look like a temple. And Joseph comes in one day, walks through the front door, he takes a look around, and he says, well, sisters, you are always on hand. The sisters are always first and foremost in all good works. Mary was first at the resurrection, and the sisters now are the first to work on the inside of the temple. Now that we've got the temple completed, I'd like to take you on a picture tour of the inside. Give you a look at some of the wonderful things that these early saints did in constructing each of the rooms of this sacred building. Now you could go to Google and search for Kirtland Temple interior pictures and spend quite a bit of time looking at pictures of the inside of the temple. But I just want to take a moment and kind of walk you through the temple so that you see the general layout and get a better understanding of the functionality of the temple. Passing through this front door, which is painted olive green to match the color it was back in the 1830s, you find yourself in a little bit of a foyer area, where if you proceed forward, you go into the main assembly room, but on to the right and left are matching staircases that are very steep that'll take you up to the second and third floor. At the top of the staircase, at the third floor, you find yourself on a little bit of a landing and at one end of a long corridor or hallway. Now, this corridor would have several classrooms off to the sides, and doors could be closed so that multiple classes could be held at the same time here on the third floor. But if you proceed all the way to the far end, you end up in Joseph Smith's personal office. This is where he would meet with individuals. Classes would be held there, but he'd also meet with his first presidency and other councils. If we take the staircases back down to the second floor, we find ourselves in a room that resembles kind of a chapel area. But it's here on the second floor in this big assembly room that the religious services weren't held. Those were down on the main floor. But here, secular knowledge and instruction would be given. You see in the rooftop here, up at the top of on the ceiling, are rollers, and on these rollers would be thick drapes, and so they could pull the drapes up on these rollers or lower the drapes down if they were ready to use them. And these drapes would divide the room into sections or quadrants, and in each section could a class or a quorum could meet, while another class or quorum is meeting on the opposite side of the partition, so that it could be a multi-purpose room. Now, if we take the stairs back down to the main level, we get to the main assembly room. Now, this is where all the religious services would take place. This is where the dedicatory services took place when Joseph Smith dedicated the Kirtland Temple. This is also on the pulpits that you see here. This is where the keys of the priesthood were restored, as recorded in section 110. The Kirtland Temple stands today as a monument to those early saints who gave so much, who gave everything in their commitment to the Lord. Their faith to follow Him and their desire to serve Him can and should stand as an example to each of us in our efforts to be His disciples each day. That does it for me. I've enjoyed sharing these stories with you, and I hope you will enjoy studying the doctrine that is contained in sections 94, 95, 96, 97. Again, my name's Tom Pettit. Thanks for tuning in, and I look forward to visiting with you and sharing with you these stories like this again next week. For more videos about our church history, make sure to subscribe.